Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome. I'm Jennifer LaRue. I'm the Director of Public Programs here at the Mark Twain House and Museum in Hartford, Connecticut. And I'm delighted to be hosting this lunchtime conversation. Usually we do our author talks in the evenings, but we've been having a lot of fun over the past few months doing some of them at lunchtime. And we're just glad that you all could be here with us. I'm not going to talk for too long, as I know I'm not what you came to hear, but I do have a little bit of stuff to share with you. First of all, I see that my colleague Jacques is in the chat, chatting away with you. Please join him there and let us know where you're from and just engage in conversation with one another. That's one of the real silver linings to this virtual programming that we've all grown so accustomed to, is that you can talk during the program and share your thoughts, which you can't do when you're sitting in a live audience. So take advantage of that opportunity if you will. However, if you have a question for any of the three panelists, yes, Jacques is the best, you're right. Rather than put those in the chat, can I ask you please to put those down at the bottom of the screen where you see the words ask a question? You can post your question there. You can look at other people's questions, and if you have the same one, you can upvote it. And just that process makes it a whole lot easier for me when I come back on toward the end of the program to manage the Q&A. While we're looking at the bottom of the screen, if I could ask you just to raise your gaze just a tiny bit to that long greenish bar that says, "Your support is vital to the Mark Twain House and Museum. Please donate here." That's really true. Your support is vital, and your support just by being here in our audience is very important to us. But we've been really proud of the job we've been able to do during the pandemic of staying connected with our audiences, growing our audiences internationally, and providing entertainment and engaging conversations for people all over the world. I have to say that while most of these programs are free to attend, they're not free to put on. And so anything that you are able to share, and we know that not everybody is in a position to share, so please know that we know that. But if you are able to share any amount of donation, just know that the Board of Trustees and the staff of the museum appreciates every single penny and puts every single penny to incredibly good use. So thank you in advance for anything you can do to help us with that. I want to thank our sponsors. Today's program, like all of our virtual programs, is sponsored by the Wish You Well Foundation and by our media sponsor, Connecticut Public, WNPR. And it's produced in part with support honoring the legacy of Frank Lord, who was a beloved trustee who passed away not long ago. And we're just really happy to be able to honor his legacy in this way. We have a lot of upcoming virtual programs and a lot of, suddenly, a couple of live events coming up. Our birthday lecture is going to be featuring David Baldacci, our birthday lecturer, in conversation with Michael Morand on November 30th. That's a free event if you're in the Hartford area and able to join us for that. The following night, on December 1st, we're having our Mark Twain American Voice in Literature Awards ceremony honoring Stephen Graham Jones for his novel, The Only Good Indians. And Stephen will be in conversation with David Baldacci, who's the founder and benefactor of that award. So again, if you're local and able to join us. And then the following night, we're hosting Jodi Picoult for her third visit, maybe her fourth visit to the Mark Twain House and Museum. And that is going to be live and in person as well. So we hope you can be here for that as well if you're local. So let me introduce our speakers tonight. Our moderator today is Dr. Ina Park. She's an associate professor of family and community medicine at the University of California, San Francisco. She's a medical consultant at the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, Division of STD Prevention, and medical director of the California Prevention Training Center. She spoke for us about her book, Strange Bedfellows, back in April 2021, and we're delighted to welcome her back. Nate Pedersen is a writer, anthologist, and lecturer in Portland, Oregon, but I understand not for much longer, if you'll mention that. He'll be in Portland. He is the co-author of Quackery, A Brief History of the Worst Ways to Cure Everything with Lydia Kang, which was published by Workman and which NPR dubbed a best science book of 2017. And his co-author, Lydia Kang, is an author and internal medicine physician. She is a graduate of Columbia University and New York University School of Medicine, and she completed her training at Bellevue Hospital in New York City. And I have to tell you, I spent a little bit of time with them in the green room, and they are all very delightful. So give me a moment just to bring everybody up on screen and join me in issuing a great big Mark Twain House Welcome to Lydia and Nate and Ina. And hi, everybody. Welcome.
Hi.
Hi, everybody.
Now, before I take myself off screen, I just want to point out that unfortunately, my copy of Patient Zero has not arrived yet. Usually I have a copy on my shelf behind me. But yes, please hold up your copy so people can see. And at the very top of the chat, and we'll repost this so it's easier to get to, there's a link that says order your signed copy of Patient Zero here. Proceeds benefit the Mark Twain House and Museum. And I just want to point out a couple things about that. First of all, you do get a signed copy if you order through us, and that's not something that you get everywhere. And also, your purchase does benefit the museum, so we're deeply appreciative to anybody who makes that purchase. So lucky me, I'm going to sit back and listen to the three of you. And Ina, will you let me know when it's time to come back on for the Q&A?
I will.
All right. Thanks so much. Have fun. I'll see you in a little bit.
Okay, well, I want to welcome everyone. Again, I'm Dr. Ina Park, and anyone who is on this program on East Coast time who might be eating their lunch while talking about infectious diseases, I know that we will get along, and so I know we're with kindred spirits here. But I want to thank both Lydia and Nate and congratulate them for such a fantastic, fascinating, and very timely work here with Patient Zero. And I want to lead off because, just acknowledging the elephant in the room, we're obviously still in the COVID-19 pandemic. And I feel like many of us have become interested in this concept of Patient Zero and the origins of SARS-CoV-2, which is the virus responsible for the current pandemic. But I know that you guys started this book before any of this was going on. And so I'm just wondering if you could tell our audience what inspired you to write about this concept in the first place.
Nate, you want to go?
Oh, go for it, Lydia.
So we actually have been tossing around ideas for a couple years now. And it wasn't until the fall of 2019 that we settled in on doing something, writing about pandemics and Patient Zero narratives. And, with Quackery, we had so much fun writing about history and medicine and history of medicine in a way that was really entertaining. Mm-hmm. And we thought, we wanted to sort of stick with this sort of history of medicine kind of vein. And so when we came up with the idea, along with our editor, we were like, oh, this is going to be perfect, because we like the idea of telling science stories, but through the perspective of like who's actually living through them, that the people. Mm-hmm. So that, and then we also really like all the tidbits of like science history themselves, like how microscopes were invented and germ theory and all that kind of stuff. So yeah, it was all pre-pandemic. We had no idea that there was going to end up being a whole chapter on COVID in here. So that was unexpected.
Yeah, and I was wondering about that because I said, okay, obviously they had to place this when they had most of the book already written, and I'm wondering, did you guys have to cut something else out, for the length of the work, because you had to add in a substantial amount of content around COVID-19?
Yeah, we had to cut a couple things out. I wrote a whole chapter on this cryptosporidium outbreak in Milwaukee, and I really like that chapter. I actually have a friend who's a physician who was practicing there when it happened, so she remembered it, and I had like quotes from her, and we had to cut it. And I was like, oh man, it's one of our only parasite chapters. Right. So that had to get cut.
Yeah. There are 16 sort of chapters that look into this concept of Patient Zero, and you're really only able to name a specific person or an animal sometimes in about 9 of them. And I think one thing that I was reflecting on when I was reading is that people have a tendency to want to know the origins of an outbreak. And especially even when I diagnose folks, because I work in HIV and sexually transmitted infections, people always want to know, where did this come from? Who did this to me? Who gave this to me, right? And people want to point a finger maybe at a specific person or group of people, and that's been going on right now as well. But you guys are both very careful in the book to say that is not the point here, like to place blame. And I'm wondering if you could expand on that a little bit, both of you.
Well, Lydia, you kind of deep dived into that topic. Maybe you should start, and I can add in a couple of things.
Yeah, sure. So it's funny because when we first decided on the topic of the book, I immediately, I could just sort of feel the hackles on my back raising up, and I was like, this could go in a place that it maybe shouldn't go, because I know the whole concept of patient zero is about sort of finding that index person who started everything. And with that comes a lot of blame. We do that all the time. Like, oh, I got a cold at a party, who gave it to me? Kind of a thing. But you are correct in that in a lot of our chapters, the people who we think are sort of like the source of the infection are oftentimes never truly the actual source. Like, it's not as, the stories are not as simple. And if anything, they're actually more fascinating because of the complexity of how things actually start. So the HIV chapter is probably one of the most difficult chapters that we had to write. It's really complicated. It's probably one of the longer chapters. Yeah. And the person that is designated as the patient zero of HIV that many people in popular culture know of, which is Gaëtan Dugas, who is this Canadian flight attendant. He is not the patient zero, but he got blamed for it. And we talk a lot about that because the patient zero moniker is really fraught with a lot of problems, to be honest.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Nate, how about you?
Yeah, I think in a way, one of the things that's interesting to think about is the converse of what patient zero, sort of like the anti-zero,
yeah,
which we can talk about a little bit. It's a really rare thing for us as a species to eradicate a disease,
mm-hmm.
Really difficult to do, but we managed to do that with smallpox, and
right.
one of like only two, that and rinderpest, that we've totally eradicated. But there was, in one of the last chapters of the book, it's about the last smallpox case, so sort of like taking this whole thing in the other direction. The last person to, and this is a whole tragedy that played out in late 1970s in Birmingham, England, where at that point in time, smallpox had been eradicated for about 2 years, and at least in terms of naturally occurring cases, but it's kept alive as a virus. The virus is kept alive for scientists to study. And unfortunately, at a place in Birmingham where it was under study, somehow or other, through a method that's still under debate today, some person connected to that study was infected by the disease and ended up, dying from smallpox, really tragically, and it caused this huge scare for the globe, for everyone around the world, really, because it was this possibility that suddenly smallpox, which is, at one point in time, like just a hugely deadly disease. I mean, right. You talk about like death toll, right? Like when that got introduced to the Americas, it possibly wiped out as many as 94 million indigenous inhabitants of North and South America, which is astounding. To go from that to having eradicated the disease is incredible. And then, right, just sort of Janet Parker, this medical photographer, ends up being, hopefully, right, the last person to ever contract and die from that disease. So the last patient zero, I guess, anti-zero.
Yeah, and I love that you guys end with her story, which is both it's interesting, that story, because it's both the triumph and a tragedy because of what ended up happening. The idea that there might have been a lapse in laboratory safety, and a researcher feeling very sort of culpable in that. And I won't spoil the entire story because I want people to read it. I think just to reflect on a story, because, from my field, we came very close to syphilis elimination about 20 years ago. And there was this whole sort of celebratory campaign by the CDC. We're going to get rid of syphilis. And 80% of the counties in the United States had no syphilis, in like 1999 and 2000. And then, of course, it just comes roaring back. And I know that you guys have seen this pattern sort of over and over. And can you both reflect on sort of the challenges of elimination or a complete eradication? And you both point out smallpox is the only real infectious disease that we've completely eradicated. And, what do you think is the magic formula here? Which I know there isn't a magic formula, but I, would love for both of you to reflect on that.
The magic formula is, it's not a static thing. It's dependent on so many different things, right? So, for example, like in the United States, Nate was writing about polio in the book, but like we don't talk about polio. I mean, you still see when you're a little kid and stuff like that, but like there is no polio in the United States. Right. And you think like, oh, it doesn't exist anymore, but it's still endemic in like Afghanistan. So depending on the country and the country's resources and the amount of vaccination, that can really drive whether or not a disease completely goes underground. But then there are other ones that are like the flu and, possibly COVID that you can't, you could possibly get rid of it if every single person was vaccinated at exactly the right moment and that virus had absolutely nowhere to go and it fizzled and died. But that's essentially impossible on a global scale because every country does its own thing. They have different abilities to vaccinate or provide treatment, and so it's just not possible. So a lot of these all these diseases that we have in these books, chapters and chapters of them, they many of them are not really gone. A lot of them are just sort of there, and they're ready to sort of pop up again, or they're sort of quietly simmering in some corner of the earth, or there's another spillover ready to happen. But as for, a perfect recipe to get rid of something, I think the smallpox example is one that shows how incredibly difficult it actually is to do.
Yeah, and just to kind of echo some of the things Lydia was saying, geopolitical instability is a problem, right? For, polio was really close to eradication. I mean, it was just kind of like what you were saying as well earlier, Dr. Park, about how with syphilis, there was almost like a preemptive celebration around the possibility of eradication. The same thing was going on with polio too, but then sort of increasing instability in regions of the world where it was still circulating, unfortunately, like in Afghanistan and Pakistan and so on, have put up significant obstacles, in front of that possibility. And of course, the other thing that we haven't quite touched on is just how deeply interconnected we all are now, of course, and how easy global travel makes it difficult to contain disease, as we all lived through recently, right? Through the COVID pandemic as well. So that just makes it tricky, and it gives a disease multiple avenues to transmit to others, and to sort of time to evolve and sort of resurface again.
Yeah, and I think one of the things you guys talk about in the book as well is that, when something is sort of out of sight in the United States, we think that it might actually be gone when it's certainly not. I mean, I think plague is an example there where, it's very much out of sight, out of mind, except that it's not gone. And so I think the thing that's wonderful about the book is it's eye-opening in the sense that people also don't think about tuberculosis because, most people don't interact with folks who are living with, tuberculosis yet. It's still certainly present. So I think the book does a great job in sort of reminding us, hey, we're not gone yet. We're not dead yet. Don't forget about us. Because I think in public health, we also tend to focus our attention and our funding on the disease of the moment. And then, things that are just not quite as common or don't have as high of incidence, we don't necessarily focus as much money on. So then our response sort of wanes, and then it makes it ripe for that to sort of spring back up.
Yeah. Unfortunately, I think like grant funding is also about like what is the sexy thing to study at the moment, which is really unfortunate. But you're right. Like in the plague chapter, we sort of end on like, oh, and by the way, like in 2020, there were a handful of plague incidences in the United States, like on our soil. And I think that kind of blows people's mind. They're like, that was supposed to be from the Middle Ages. Like that's supposed to be gone. It's like, no. And then every time there's like a measles outbreak, like at Disney World or something like that, it just sort of is a reminder that like these things can resurge. And it's not like they're trying to get back at us. They don't have a personality or something, but this is the nature of infectious diseases. They're just waiting for that little opening, and then boom, they just sort of pounce on us. So.
Exactly. And I think one of your points is that, we're learning more and more about how to be prepared. And then sometimes, somehow often we just get caught as a society with our pants down, every time, you know what I mean? Even though we know what we need to do to a certain extent. And sometimes we don't know, like when we have a completely novel virus, but often we don't necessarily learn from the mistakes of our past, which is something I reflected on when I was reading your book as well. One of the things about the format that I really enjoyed were interspersed between the chapters. Often at the end of a chapter are these sort of little 1 to 5 page vignettes, you know what I mean? That are sometimes related to the preceding chapter, or sometimes they're introducing a new concept or sort of challenging conventional wisdom. And they're often, they're surprisingly like playful and fun, even though some of the topics are really terrifying, like fatal insomnia, for example, due to prions. But I'm just wondering about how you decided to go with that format, and how did you decide what content deserved to be pulled out and put in those little vignettes? And if you could, each share one of your favorites for the audience, because I love that component of the book in particular.
Yeah, I think that's a little bit of a nod back to our first book, Quackery, which had a lot of, what we call sidebars, sort of anecdotal asides to sort of the main narrative thrust of the chapter. So they're a lot of fun to write, I think, because it allows you to cover something that doesn't necessarily fit into, you obviously when you're writing a chapter, you want to kind of try to arc that like a story, right? And so the ability to dive a little bit off to the side and investigate related interesting topics, I think is a real benefit of a book like this. And also I think, as a reader, I think it's actually kind of nice to have those sort of breaks. It's kind of like, in my mind, a little bit like the enjoyment you get from reading a magazine. You can kind of jump around and it's very visual. In terms of a favorite, let me scan through for a second. Do you have one that comes right to mind, Lydia?
Let's see. One of my favorites that you did was probably like the biblical plagues, because I think that, I can't remember, did we actually have that as like its own chapter and then we ended up turning it into a mini thing? I think we did, because it was too big and we had to like kind of shorten a couple things. Like I had a sidebar on how like antibiotic resistance was being a whole other sort of unseen pandemic of bug resistance, and that completely got cut. So I think my infectious diseases doctor friends are going to be very disappointed.
Yeah, I'm sure they will.
Yeah, but I think one of my favorites is the, and I kind of had to fight for this one to stay because they were going to cut it, was the Ring Around the Rosie story. Yeah. So you know how you used to sing this all the time when you were a little kid, Ring Around the Rosie, pocket full of posies, ashes, ashes, we all fall down. And I think at some point in time, we were all like, maybe in our teens or 20s or 30s, and we're like, oh God, that was actually about the plague. Can you believe we were little kids and we were singing that song? And it was like, ring around the rosies was this rash you get when you get the plague, pockets full of posies because you're holding like flowers in your pockets because of the stench of dead, like, corpses everywhere, ashes, ashes, because they are burning the corpses, and we all fall down because we're all dying from bubonic plague. And it made sense. And I was like, God, a terrible thing for like little kids to be singing. And then when I researched it, I found out that it has absolutely nothing to do with the plague. That definition of how that song came to be kind of showed up sometime after World War II. And there's zero like literary evidence of that being a reason for why that sing-song chant actually has it. And so what they think it actually is a little bit more about is just a kind of a nonsensical rhyme, like the ring around the rosy, rosier is like a rose tree. The ashes, ashes might actually be a chew, which is sort of like a sneeze. And the we all fall down might actually be a curtsy. And so it might be a little bit more of a pagan type origin. So nobody knows exactly for sure what it means, but it's definitely not related to the plague.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's a great one, and actually one of the ones I found really interesting, so I'm an anthropology major, back in the day, and the chapter about indigenous peoples and the Columbian Exchange had a sidebar on uncontacted peoples or uncontacted tribes. I just think it's just an interesting thing to think about in this, we talked about the interconnectedness of the globe, and yet despite that, right, despite how deeply interconnected we are, there's still like 100 odd identified groups, cultural groups or tribes that are in different parts of the world that still, for all practical reasons, haven't really been in contact with the modern world. And we're aware of them, and we're aware of where they exist, and we've drawn boundaries around those areas to prevent this kind of thing from happening, because typically, as we've seen play out over and over in history, when new pathogens are introduced to a community that hasn't been exposed to them before, it's like a virgin soil epidemic. You're looking at mortality rates that can hover around 50%, maybe even higher. So we've purposefully, there's a few reasons, but that's one of the reasons we purposely not pursued contact with some folks that are living in very remote parts of the Amazon, for example, or in New Guinea. So I think that's just an interesting thing to think about.
Well, for the audience, my favorite one of these vignettes, which was not news to me, and I'll tell you why, was the vignette about the tick bite that causes an allergy to red meat. And I encountered someone on a business trip who was very upset at a restaurant where we were getting takeout because she was explaining she has an allergy to red meat, and then the person was saying, the restaurant worker was saying, oh, that's not a real thing, that doesn't really exist. And she was Right, and then she was from the South. She's from Texas, and she was explaining this tick bite causes this meat allergy. And I said, "This is wild." And I looked it up, and I said, "Oh my God, this is really a thing." And I just think it's fascinating. There are not that many people who are affected by that yet. It's not a hugely prevalent issue, but that was devastating for her because she was a meat lover, and suddenly being deathly allergic to red meat meant, like a complete change in lifestyle. So I love that vignette, by the way. I'm so glad you guys did that.
I first heard about that, I think, on a Radio Lab. I don't know if you guys listen to Radio Lab, but it is such a great podcast. And that was the first time I'd heard about the alpha-gal allergy. And if you ever have a moment and you want to listen to it just from beginning to end, it's definitely well worth the listen. But it's really interesting how our relationship with the things that we eat and we consume and the allergens around us, they end up trying to kill us in other ways, not necessarily infectious wise. So.
Yeah. Another thing I wanted to reflect on was, there's a great headline from, it's not the most august publication in the world, but it's a National Enquirer. And this was during the investigation around Legionnaire's disease. And the headline, which is going to be backwards for you all, but it says, Legionnaire's disease, the great hoax. And it just made me reflect on the same kind of, the same kind of narrative that's been going on during COVID-19, where there's a lot of disbelievers. And I would love for you both to reflect on, on both the Legionnaire's outbreak and the sort of disbelief by the public around it, and why we have such a hard time believing that these infectious diseases are causing our illness and death.
So that is actually a common occurrence. When we were writing the chapter on the plague, much of the chapter focuses on when the bubonic plague hits San Francisco in around 1900, right? And so when they were having ships sort of quarantine a little bit, and obviously businesses weren't happy about that. And so there was an article that came out in the San Francisco Chronicle that dubbed the disease a phantom. So as you can see, there is a lot of this sort of is this thing actually real or not? And with Legionnaire's disease, it was a really strange thing because, some infections you give to other people, right? You spread it like the flu or like COVID, and other ones, they sort of something infects people and then it just sort of stays in the people. So for example, rabies, right? You get bit by a dog, you have rabies, and most of the time, the person's not biting other people. It stays in that one person and doesn't spread to a whole airport. Legionnaire's was a little bit like that, in that people got sick from this pulmonary disease. They didn't know where it was from. And as soon as it arrived, it disappeared. And not only that, but the people who were working at the CDC and in these labs, they couldn't find it. They couldn't find the bacteria. I mean, this was 1976. So it's not 1876. I mean, they had the ability to really track down bugs pretty well at that time, and they could not find it. And because they couldn't find it, everybody's yelling at the CDC. It disappeared. They were like, this thing isn't real. And so the CDC got a lot of flack about screwing it up, and they can't find it, and they're making a big deal out of nothing. It's not real. But it wasn't until I think around Christmas time of that year, the outbreak happened around the 4th of July. And or in July sometime, but it wasn't until December that they finally found it. It was kind of accidental that the laboratory guy actually did find it. He decided to work over the holidays and clean things up, and he saw a couple specks on the side of a slide that he'd sort of ignored and was like, wait a second. And that's how they found Legionella, which is the bacteria that's responsible for Legionnaire's disease. But yeah, a lot of backlash to that. And I remember every time I read something like that, I'm always just like, some things don't change,
Yeah. It's true. I mean, and I wonder if it's because, when there's a fire and some sort of natural disaster, it's very clear what is going on. And I think when we're talking about an infectious disease, it's often something we can't see. And so, I think some of us have a hard time believing something we can't actually see with our own eyes. And the scientists tell us we've isolated the virus, we've sequenced the virus, or we've isolated the bacteria or parasite that's causing the issue. And yet, still, it's difficult sometimes for us to believe that that's really going on.
Yeah. You know, I was having a conversation with somebody this morning from WebMD about why some vaccines people seem to want to get and why some people don't want to get. And I have a personal theory that if smallpox came back, everyone would get vaccinated because
It's
not
so
only does it have a very high death rate, but
right.
it's permanently disfiguring. Like it
Right.
permanently changes what you look like. It's just a very horrible looking disease. You guys are eating, so do not Google what smallpox looks like right now. Just wait until you've finished digesting your food because it is really, really horrific. And I honestly do think that because COVID and the flu are things that you can't see and the death rates aren't astronomical, people feel like it's just sort of a little bit more of a phantom illness in a lot of ways.
Yeah.
Yeah, a lot of the chapters that I wrote were on diseases or illnesses that had a lot more, like to your point about smallpox, like, you know, rabies, for example, or yellow fever or cholera, like really, really strong, like really virulent diseases that had really like obvious symptoms. Like it wasn't really up for debate. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Um, uh, I think the one that I wrote that's probably the closest to what you've asked about is on syphilis, which connects back to your work as well, right, Dr. Park? Which
Yeah.
is kind of interesting because it's such a tricky disease and it has these various stages that evolves through, and there's long periods of being asymptomatic.
Right.
Except for like this really interesting thing in the historical record when syphilis first really gets going in Europe, right, in like the
Right.
late 15th century.
Yep.
And it's like really strong. It's like a really virulent disease, really quickly goes through the stages and like just wipes people out. And then it kind of evolves, right, into something that's a little trickier.
Right. I mean, I think the whole thing with an infectious disease is if you kill the host before you have a chance to spread, that's not really adaptive, right? So now syphilis can be infectious and silent for quite a long time, which allows its sexual spread very easily. And that's what we're dealing with right now. It's like a game of whack-a-mole. There's like constant cases of syphilis popping up. So that's a great example as well.
And tuberculosis is similar to that as well. Like tuberculosis somehow evolved to cause an infection and then it becomes latent, which is a word that means it just kind of goes to sleep in your body. And then later on, it can sort of show up and like, cause illness again. But again, you kill the host right away, you don't have a chance to spread. Whereas this is like a really fantastic way of survival for tuberculosis to just sort of like squat inside a human being until the time is right. And then you're coughing up and spewing it out and spreading it to everybody else. But yeah, like syphilis and tuberculosis they've also probably been with us for a long time. I don't know exactly when syphilis like entered the human population, like the beginning. I don't know if you can answer that question. I don't think we came upon that, but tuberculosis was definitely around probably since the dawn of man, most likely.
That's a very controversial, I would say, sort of issue that's debated among my colleagues because I know you guys had mentioned Christopher Columbus, which I think is, a reasonable person to call patient zero, but some folks feel like,
it's hard to know.
It's been with us, even prior to, in prehistoric times, and that there's some evidence from bony lesions that have been found, that perhaps it's been with us for even it's been with us for longer than that, but I actually don't think anybody truly knows. And I just, you had mentioned tuberculosis, and it sort of brings to mind the wild things that people will try to cure an infection before we actually had antibiotics. And I'm wondering if you guys could, there's a TB and vampires little vignette there. I'm wondering if you guys could expand on that a tiny bit for the audience.
Oh, sure. So in the tuberculosis chapter, we talk a little bit about how around the late 1800s in the New England area, there was this belief that there might be vampires that were sickening people. And it was thought that people who were dying of consumption would actually wake up from the dead or arise from the grave somehow and like start picking off members of the family. So the other families would start to get thinner and sicker, and then they would die. And then another one would get thinner and sicker and then die. And so they actually dug up some corpses of people who had died from consumption. And, you know, I think some of these were probably dug up in the middle of winter. So the corpses hadn't really, you know,
Right.
they hadn't
Decomposed.
yet. Exactly. And so they're like, oh, clearly this is a vampire. This person looks just as fresh as when we put him in a month ago. And so they would like, they dig up the corpse and they would like chop the head off and burn it and then like feed the ashes to the living relatives who would sometimes live, but oftentimes would just die anyway. Yeah, so that whole concept of vampirism and tuberculosis has an interesting kind of history.
Yeah. And, you know, I realized, wow, we're almost getting to the end of our time because I'm only supposed to talk for 40 minutes here with you. But I want to have room to talk about two things. Number one is we have to tell the story about the N95 masks and the bras. And then I have a very specific question about writing for you guys because I am also a writer. And so I'm so very curious about something about your process. So start with the N95 and the bra, and then we'll go into your relationship and your writing process.
Okay, so the N95 and the bra. I'll take this one because I wrote that chapter. So it's in the medical advancements chapter, which is for at the end. So we end on this positive note of like, look at all these great things that have happened as a result of infectious diseases and pandemics and research and all that. So there was this woman named Sarah Little Turnbull who was an editor at House Beautiful. And she was asked by the company 3M, which is that company that makes Post-it notes.
Yeah.
To work on like these melted polymers to make like gift wrapping ribbon. So while she was working with them, you know, these polymers were coming together in these like sort of woven fabric. She was like, this would make really good padding for bras and shoulder pads and stuff like that. So, you know, that was really cool. And then towards the end of the 1950s, she had a couple of family members that were ill in the hospital. And while that was happening, she was like, you know, they've got to be able to do something better with these masks because there's got to be a better way to protect people. Because masks were being worn, like especially by surgeons and things like that, but they were masks, not respirators. Actually, respirators filter out really tiny microscopic particles and aerosols, whereas masks just do more like bigger drips and coughs and stuff. So, so she ended up working with 3M, and they helped. Their work ended up developing into what was the N95 mask that we were also desperate to get at the beginning of this pandemic. But yeah, it kind of started with there was like a little sort of lingerie moment there that happened before the masks. But it's really funny. Do you guys remember at the beginning of the pandemic when we couldn't find masks and then people making these homemade things? And I saw photos of people putting bra cups on their face. And I laughed along with most other people thinking like, oh, you guys are, and it's ingenious, but it's kind of ridiculous. It's silly. But they were actually onto something.
They really were.
Yeah.
Yep. Well, and these days, you know, you can get very thickly padded bras if you're not well endowed, you know, in the chest. So you can get a lot of filtration there, possibly.
I know you could probably get like something that was, it might be so padded that you can't breathe through it. So you got to be
literally
careful if you're going to make one of those.
So in the last few minutes, can I say I have never written this length of work with another person. I've done very short pieces or maybe journal articles or something. And I am fascinated by the fact that you guys were able to do this twice now with two different books. So I'm wondering, how did you decide to team up, and sort of what's your process? Because it sounds like maybe like Nate wrote some chapters and Lydia, you wrote some chapters, but you want to make it sound like all one voice eventually. So how did you meet, and how do you guys kind of work it all out to produce a book together?
Sure. So we met. So Lydia is a novelist as well.
Yes.
And my wife is also a novelist. Her name's April DeHulke, and she and Lydia both had books, young adult books, coming out with Penguin the same year in 2013. It was their debut novel, and so they were on kind of a similar publicity tour together. And at one point, I was with, and we all were hanging out and having fun, and found we had a similar sense of humor and a similar curiosity about the world that would maybe occasionally tend toward the morbid. And so those things kind of united together. And actually my wife April suggested that she's like, you two should team up and write something. And that's what produced that partnership is what produced Quackery. And we found, I think, pretty early on, Lydia, right, that we found pretty quickly that we had a really good ability to balance each other. And so you're right, that we do divide the chapters up, and we each take one and get it to a draft form, and the other person kind of offers some input as well.
Yeah.
But we're able to unite the tone, I think, successfully, which is a tricky thing when you're working with an author. And I think both Quackery and Patient Zero, which have different tones. Quackery is a lot lighter hearted, a lot more jokey, and Patient Zero is a lot more serious. But I think, and there are some more lighthearted moments too. But I think that we do have a good ability to mirror each other's voices and create a unified whole. And then plus, Lydia is just a blast to work with. So we just have a lot of fun together too.
Right. You obviously liked it enough the first time to do it the second time. Well,
I think we're lucky in that, Nate's written I don't know how many hundreds of articles, and every time you write an article for a place, they're going to expect it to have a certain tone. So you have to sort of meld probably your writing to whatever is the venue. And then I've written in young adult and adult historical, and I've done formal essays and medical writing. And so I guess we're both used to figuring out how to match voices to what we need to do. So that helps.
Yeah.
Maybe a chameleon of sorts. We are near the end of our time. I just want to say that the book does, absolutely. There needs to be moments that are serious, but it is actually surprisingly playful and fun at times as well. So everyone should get it. Patient Zero, it's great. I'm going to bring Jennifer on, Jennifer LaRue from the Mark Twain House, to do some Q&A.
Before we move to the audience questions, I just have to say I was laughing, and then the three of you were smiling and laughing. And I kept having to remind myself what we were actually talking about here.
Right.
It's been absolutely delightful. And I have been a lifelong hypochondriac, and these issues of infectious disease have given me nightmares my entire life. And I can't believe that I'm sitting here enjoying talking about them with you. So thank you for that. Maybe you have turned a corner. So we have some very good questions, and one of them from B. She'd just like you to kind of run through can you rattle off what the list of the diseases that your book covers, and what criteria did you use to choose which ones to write about? Good question, B.
Oh, wow. So it's funny because we've been doing a lot of interviews and publicity. So I have my book totally, there you go. These are all the different chapters. So the book is interesting. We ended up dividing it into three major sections. And so we have a section on infection, and we have a section on spread, and then we have a section on containment. And those were three themes that came up all the time every time we wrote about a different infection. And so it kind of made sense to sort of group them in that way, about how their stories were sort of prominently featured in this infection, in the spread, in the containment type of situation. So I don't know. I think Nate and I, we just brainstormed, we just sort of vomited on the page, just every infectious disease that we could sort of think of, as far as what has hit history. And a lot of this carried over from Quackery, right? So syphilis and some other things that we had mentioned, the plague. Tons of these diseases throughout history had already popped up in on our radar from our previous writing. And so our list just sort of got bigger and bigger. And then we started to just really look for other things. We Googled other outbreaks. And so I wanted to find, I wanted to do a particular, slightly more modern outbreak scenario where we could sort of talk about how outbreak investigations happened. And so I ended up picking cryptosporidium and Legionnaire's disease, and the crypto one got cut. So that one I think we're going to save for another, the DVD, if somebody or something like that.
The DVD extra.
That was shock.
But Legionnaire's ended up being a really perfect case study, because enough time has gone by. They've been able to look at it backwards about, how did we do this, and how did we really figure it out, and that sort of a thing. But I think we all just came up with we just put together, we crammed in as much as we could, and some of it did get cut. We couldn't fit it all together. So.
Yeah, and I think you're always looking for, you want to be comprehensive, of course, but you also are looking for good stories, and I think that's a uniting thread as well.
Yeah.
Sure.
Yeah. Like somebody had asked me earlier, they're like, how come there isn't a chapter on MERS? And I was like, you know, COVID kind of bumped that one out, because we were like, we'll have a chapter on COVID and question, and like how COVID sort of unfolded originally. And we mentioned MERS a little bit, but there just wasn't enough room to do everything, you know. So diphtheria and dysentery. I mean, there's other things we just couldn't hit. So.
And diphtheria is what Mark Twain's one son died of when he was just a tiny little toddler. So next book, you have to include that and then come back and talk with us about that, okay?
Yeah.
And am I the only one who's finding it mind-boggling that Legionnaire's disease was in 1976? That just doesn't seem possible. That seems so long ago.
I mean, that's when it all sort of happened. But then after they found it, they were like, wait a second. This is actually also known as Pontiac fever. And it turns out there was another outbreak earlier. And so Legionnaire's has been around. And it wasn't until 1976 that they found it and gave it a name and saw it on a microscope slide. But before that, it'd been causing problems before. So it's like, what else is out there that's causing problems that we haven't identified? Probably many things.
It was a moment where, as well, like they were able to connect the dots between multiple other outbreaks that had happened. Yes. Veggie, you know, like the grocery store veggie misters and Pontiac fever. I mean, you know, it was like suddenly all these little clusters and they were all connected by a common thread. Finally.
Yeah. It's pretty cool. I mean, if you like mysteries, a lot of these stories are basically like unfolding mysteries, right? Yeah. So, yeah.
Thank you. So I'm not sure, our audience member N. Price has a question and a follow-up saying, I'm not trying to blame, but the question is, isn't there still polio? Because they, and I'm not sure who they is, would not permit vaccination when the Gates Foundation wanted to vaccinate them, or maybe I'm thinking of smallpox. Does this strike any bells with anybody that you want to say anything about?
So, you know, this kind of goes back to the geopolitical instability in some of the regions where polio is still circulating around, it's still a bit endemic, you know, so there were attempts by, you know, Western foundations like the Gates Foundation to vaccinate in those areas that have met political resistance, you know, the Taliban being one example that had you know, would not permit vaccination efforts to take place. And then in turn, of course, polio continues to circulate. So yes, that is true.
Thank you.
Yeah. And then another thing, you know, which we bring up in the chapter, which is the Savin vaccine, which is the live vaccine. It's the one that the little pink drops that you get or whatever. It can actually become pathogenic in a really small percentage of people who receive the vaccine. And then that ends up in the water supply. And if you don't have really clean water or there's a hygiene issue, it can re-enter the community again and then start causing polio. So that's, I think they think that variant, it's called like the CVDPV variant, is also causing the endemicity in Afghanistan. So I think they're hoping that they can go to the injectable kind, which is a killed virus, but it's like doing drops is so easy compared to like having a syringe with needles. And it's just, we really take for granted how easy it is that you can just go to a doctor or pharmacy and just like get a shot and you're done. Like that takes so much infrastructure for that to happen. And that just doesn't exist in a lot of places. So
I'm glad you pointed that out. We really shouldn't take that for granted, should we?
No. It's like, you know how you're mentioning diphtheria? Like that's in your tetanus shot. You know, it's coupled with your tetanus shot most of the time, right? And so you don't even think about, like, people probably don't even know exactly what diphtheria is, but it's like a horrible way to die. Honestly, it kind of like chokes you to death. And that's also something that's just not seen in our country anymore for a really long time, because they were really smart and they stuck that diphtheria vaccine, like they coupled it with the tetanus. And so every time you go see your healthcare person and they were like, oh, it's 10 years, time for your tetanus shot, you know, you're getting immunized for something else that you just don't really think about.
Well, that's a luxury, isn't it?
It is.
You have to think about it. So I'm going to step back and ask a question of my own, which is, in the grand scheme of humanity and the other creatures and bacteria and everything that we live with, why do these diseases exist? Why do infectious diseases have any place in the world? It's kind of like asking, why do mosquitoes exist? Like, I can never answer that question.
Oh my God. That's a really big one. I mean, I think it just is one of those things. It's just asking, like, why are there trees? Why are there earthworms? They are part of our ecosystem. And I think that we have a tendency to be very human centric, sort of like everything is here for us and we are here. And everything, if something else is around, it's at our benevolence that we allow it to exist. But the truth is that infectious diseases don't play by those rules. They don't care about us. They don't care, really. They're just trying to survive. And they have been with us since, the dawn of, since that first DNA molecule ever happened during evolution. I mean, they are survivors and they try to figure out their little niche in the world as well. And we're a food source, we're a host, just like, that cow out there, or, a fly on the wall that also gets infected by something else. So it's very interesting to think of this sort of like war on infectious diseases when it's, we're still kind of a bit player in a lot of ways. And yet we have changed our environment so much to the point where things are coming back to bite us. And we're sort of like, why is this happening? Why are all these spillovers happening? And it's like, we are one of the reasons they're happening. We're destroying, natural ecosystems. We are burning forests, doing industrialized agriculture with tons and tons of antibiotics and creating antibiotic resistance and stuff like that. And then, people who are just, these things sort of sweep through our country and we're like, I don't understand why this is happening. And we have to sort of take a step back and see the bigger picture and what part we play in it.
Yeah, I think it's interesting, writing a book like this, you sort of put yourself into the perspective of the virus, right? Like, and obviously, like, a virus particle doesn't have like what we would identify anyway as intelligence or whatever, but it's kind of like if you've read Michael Pollan's work and you start to think about plants as having kind of their own agenda in terms of their interaction with humanity, it's the same thing, right, for a virus. And I think you start to, or at least I did, right, as I was writing this book, start to think about kind of like what my favorite viruses were, in terms of like how they had evolved to respond to a situation, or from their point of view, like how they had become successful, and for me that was rabies, which is a fascinating virus, and had it's basically a guaranteed death sentence if you have rabies and you don't get vaccinated. It's like 100% mortality rate, like the worst mortality rate of any disease we covered in the book. And it's just kind of an astounding thing, some of the things it does, knowing that it's going to kill its host. I'm citing intelligence here, but that's just how we have to kind of talk about it. Sort of knowing that it's going to kill its host, it has a limited window to transfer over, and how it creates those avenues, those opportunities, is kind of like spooky and admirable in equal measures, So.
Yeah.
Am I allowed to comment, even though I'm not an author of this book? I have to say
that
I really enjoyed. Well, one thing that you guys did really well was just, pointing out that we're all beings trying to survive in the world, and we're existing, right, in an ecosystem together. And I think, so not thinking of it as like it is a war of us against them, because, as you both know very intimately, like, microbes are part of our entire, they live on and within us, and they really make us who we are. And so I think, if we think about it in that way, and just that we're all trying to survive, and therefore we're going to be passing things to each other, whether it be from breathing or skin to skin contact or sex or whatever, it's sort of destigmatizes, this idea around infections and this tendency we might have to blame other people. It's like, we just all are trying to survive, the viruses, the bacteria, the parasites, and us. And I think we just, by living, we have to accept that we are going to be exchanging these things, within ourselves and among ourselves.
And I think people have come to a better understanding of that. Like, I think everybody's like so obsessed with gut health, right? Yes. They're like, oh my God, my microbiome, I need to eat more kimchi. Like, right. Who isn't like, has heard of that or been somewhat obsessed about making sure they're getting enough probiotics and fiber and all that kind of stuff. And I think like the that dawning of an understanding that, like, the microbes in your body can be its own living organism that is really important for your immunological health and your digestive health and like all this kind of stuff, I think really opens a lot of people's eyes to how we weren't just this like sterile single creature living in this bubble and there's everything outside. Like, let's not scrub everything. Let's actually preserve our skin barrier, because like, that is an important thing. So I think maybe there is some thought that there's change as far as like realizing that it's really not us versus them. There's a better understanding of it, at least. But yeah, like it's been really fascinating researching this and like realizing how very little we are and yet powerful we are in this sort of relationship we have with microbes.
Right. So this is a selfish question. I'm a new grandma. I have a little tiny granddaughter now, and it made me think about this theory that was circulating at the time that my children were little, which was that the whole thing about your house shouldn't be too clean, and you should have a shedding dog, and you should have germs around, so that they develop resistance. What do we know about that whole dynamic at this point?
Well, I don't know if I'll give you a satisfactory answer, but I think it's interesting that people who are really like all about having like a super clean, sterile house for their children. I don't necessarily think that's a great thing. I think that we're surrounded by things that allow our immune systems to react to and bounce off of and that sort of thing. And that's okay. And I remember learning that when I was like a new mom, like with my first child. My son ended up in the ICU, and I remember being able to hold him for the first time. And I was so scared because I was like, I should go wash my hands, and is it okay that I'm wearing these clothes? And I was going to pick him up, and the ICU doctor was just like, he's covered in your flora. Mm-hmm. He's like, you are the one person, like, you can pick him up, and you guys are all matched. You all have the same like skin flora because you gave it to him. And I just remember thinking like, again, like this whole sterility thing, something is not always the best thing. But I know there's like plenty of research out there about, asthma and allergy rates, and somebody who grew up on a farm where they're covered in dirt versus someone who grew up in a more sterile environment. And, I think the research probably tends towards it's more antigens is not necessarily a bad thing, but we live in a very allergic world. So I don't want to make any assumptions here without doing my research.
Good. Thank you. That's helpful. We have 3 minutes left. I'd like each of you to rapid fire tell me what gives you nightmares? What do you see looming on the horizon that scares the pants off you?
Oh my God. That's a really good question. Probably another spillover event, something like Ebola, but that has, it spreads through the air. So Ebola is spread through contact. But if Ebola was something that was spread through aerosolization, like you could get it in an airport and it has a very, very high mortality, that would be devastating. Like that would absolutely scare the pants off of me. Like, thank goodness COVID didn't have a higher mortality, like in, the 1918 flu or something like that. But like, we're always just like 3 steps away from like a pandemic being something like the medieval plague, like killing off half the population or something like that. So that's what scares me, is like a future thing.
Okay, top that, you two.
I'm going to make Nate go first because I have to think about my answer.
Yeah, I mean, I was kind of just going to go to the same spot that Lydia went, in terms of what you are thinking about as you're writing a book like that, right? Like, this sort of this experience that we all collectively live through, you can view it in a lot of ways as like a dress rehearsal with relatively low stakes. And I know that, like, I don't mean to downplay obviously the significance of the event and like the people that have their lives significantly altered and died from it and so on. But relatively speaking, compared to a lot of the diseases, Ebola is a great example. Like mortality rates could be way, way, way higher than they were ever for COVID.
Yeah.
And if you combine that with a transmission rate, or like to Lydia's point, something like as deadly as Ebola that can spread through the air, you know, like that's the term in terms of like global havoc that would cause. I mean, it's almost incomprehensible, you know. I mean, it's just so the scale is just incredible to think of. So I would say that too, and I think, you know, COVID in some ways is sort of just, you know, the first round, you know. So
Well,
I think working in infectious disease, I just don't. I'm kind of sort of numb to being worried about things so much outside. But what really does scare me is climate change and how we have, you know, manipulated and, you know, destroyed ecosystems and the planet, and what that might do in terms of causing emerging infectious diseases. Excuse me. So, you know, they're related, but really, you know, that concerns me more about how will we alter the environment, and then how will the environment respond, and, you know, is that going to wipe us out as a species?
Right. I have a friend, Tosca Lee, who wrote a book about the permafrost melting, and this virus gets released and causes like a massive worldwide pandemic that kills
There
like
you
everybody
go.
else. And I was just like, this is a little too close to home.
Yes, exactly.
well,
Yeah.
that is an issue already, you know, to
Yeah.
your point, you know, that's something that's happening already in Siberia, and there's been cases of anthrax being reintroduced to the environment after having, you know, and I think in this case it was reindeer. So reindeer had been infected by anthrax and died a long time ago, and been buried under permafrost, and that
Yeah.
permafrost melted, and their bodies were re-exposed to the air and to microbes, and then as they continued the decomposition process, anthrax spores were released, you know, which, and anthrax spores are an interesting thing too, because it takes very, 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 very little anthrax to cause significant problems, you know, so
That's
like a
true.
spore of anthrax actually is
Yeah.
a pretty big deal. So,
Yeah.
you know, yeah.
So these dystopian novelists have got something going on here, is what we're saying. Unfortunately.
They do very much so.
well, I'm just going to say carpe diem. We're going to just make the most of our lives without worrying too much about these things. But my gosh, what a fascinating hour! Thank you, all three of you, for sharing your knowledge and your good spirits. It's been really a fun conversation too. Can I ask you all to hold your books up again, please? And I apologize. The link that we had initially shared was incorrect, but Jacques has corrected it. So find that link and order your signed copy of Patient Zero. And will you all come see us in person one day soon?
I would love to.
Yeah, absolutely.
Nate, hold yours up. I'm taking a quick screenshot.
Okay.
Yay, thank you.
There you go. Awesome.
Go buy it right now. Go to our tiny house.
Do buy it right now. And thank you, all three of you, for being here. And I want to address a question in the chat. Yes, this program is recorded, and anybody can come back and watch it anytime they like just by following the original link. So enjoy it now or later. Lydia, Nate, and Ina, thank you so much for a fantastic conversation. It's been awesome.
Thank you for having us. Jennifer and Ina, thank you guys so much. This is awesome. And Nate, as always.
Good to meet you guys.
You too.
Let's do it again soon.
Bye-bye.
Yeah. Thanks. Bye-bye.
Bye, all.